Hi. The text came on a Thursday evening, around 9:30, as I was finishing some last edits for a quarterly report. Relationship check-in dinner. Just us. Thought it would be grounding. I reread it twice, noting the phrasing. Lately, her language had shifted. Words that didn't used to be hers were finding their way in. We'd always had sharp conversations, plain words. Now I heard alignment, frameworks, expansion creeping into casual exchanges. Still, I replied, "Of course. Just tell me when." She suggested the following Friday. She picked the place. Not one of our usual spots, but a new restaurant known for intentional dining experiences. I didn't argue. I arrived 10 minutes early and asked for a corner table. When she came in, flowing linen dress, a new leather notebook in hand, and a smile just a bit too fixed, I stood, kissed her cheek, and sat across from her. We ordered quickly, either of us lingering on the menu. The waiter left us alone, the wine untouched between us. She opened her notebook, uncapped a fountain pen, and gave me a measured look. "I've been working through some new frameworks," she began, "about how partnership evolves." Her voice was calm, paced, but not her usual cadence. "Too careful." I nodded. "I'm listening." What followed wasn't dialogue. It was presentation. She spoke of radical partnership, expansive love, personal sovereignty. Words delivered with an even tone, as though memorized. I didn't interrupt. Inside, my mind was moving fast, mapping the language, the pacing, her slight hesitations when she glanced at her notes. This wasn't spontaneous. This was coached. Between sentences, her eyes flicked up to gauge my reactions. I kept my expression open, neutral. She leaned forward slightly. "I think we've both grown in ways we couldn't have predicted when we married." A familiar hook. In other words, the contract is now up for negotiation. Still, I said nothing. I wanted her to keep talking. She continued, "I've been working with a consulting group that's really helping me understand how traditional relationship structures can limit growth." There it was, an external influence, now named though vaguely. Consulting group. I logged it mentally, waiting. She glanced at her phone. It buzzed once. Her eyes caught the screen. Something shifted in her expression, small but unmistakable. A real smile. The first one of the evening. I followed her gaze. The phone angled slightly, likely unintentional. I caught the name. RK Coach. New data point. Unknown entity. Logged. She noticed me noticing and spoke quickly. "One of my mentors," she said, casual tone a little too light. "We've been working a lot on these ideas." I smiled, the kind of easy smile that gives nothing away. "Interesting," I replied. "You've always been good at finding sharp minds to learn from." She relaxed fractionally, encouraged by the lack of pushback. Mistake. The meal arrived, but she barely touched hers. Between small bites, she returned to the notebook, reading sections aloud about conscious uncoupling and non-hierarchical love systems. Internally, I traced the shift. This wasn't a check-in. It was positioning. The groundwork for a structural change. I found my mind drifting, involuntarily, to earlier times. Dinners where conversation flowed without orchestration. Nights when plans were made on napkins, laughter sudden and real. Those weren't coming back. I knew that now, sitting across from this version of her. She reached across the table, fingers brushing mine. "I want us both to feel fully free. To have space to be our best selves." I met her gaze evenly. "Freedom matters," I replied. "It always has." But beneath my words, the decision had already formed. No confrontation tonight. Not yet. That would give away too much. Instead, I would observe. Map her language. Note every shift, every new pattern. And I would start preparing. Quietly. Strategically. When the time came, the moves would be precise. No theatrics. No anger. Just controlled execution. The rest of the meal played out with polite conversation, her part marked by growing confidence, as if the pitch had landed. When we rose to leave, her embrace was light, distracted. She checked her phone again as we parted. RK was still waiting, it seemed. I walked to my car with a mind already moving down new paths. There would be no sleep tonight, not until I'd started mapping the landscape she thought she was controlling. The morning after the dinner, I sat in my home office with a legal pad open and a clean browser window on my laptop. No search history, no logins tied to our shared accounts. Across the hallway, she moved through her morning routine, yoga sessions streamed from some new service, followed by a smoothie whose ingredients now included unfamiliar powders and tinctures. Her world had shifted into a parallel track. Mine would shift to match. I started with the obvious, RK Coach. The name from her phone. The search turned up a sleek personal website, one of those templated modern designs heavy on empty space and aspirational language. No full name listed, just RK. No verifiable credentials. But there was an LLC, registered under Sovereign Horizons Group. A shell structure, but with recent spikes in activity, workshops, one-on-one. Executive Sovereignty Consults, deep dive immersions. I read every word 3 times. The language echoed what she'd said at dinner. Same phrasing. Same ideology. I began logging every new term she'd used into my notes, building a map of the ecosystem she was entering. Later that week, she casually mentioned an immersion weekend. Women's circle, off-grid, really important for my growth right now. I nodded, supportive, asked no questions, but when the hotel charge hit our joint account 3 days later, a $1,287 charge at the Valari Boutique Hotel, I noted the date immediately. Same weekend. Valari wasn't off-grid. It was a luxury hotel downtown, known for its private suites and in-house wellness consultants. She hadn't bothered to mask it. A mistake. I said nothing. Just added the statement to my file, flagged it. That same afternoon, while syncing a calendar for a shared investment project, a stray event popped up, one she clearly meant to keep private. 1:1 Consult with RK, Valari, 7 p.m. Date matched the hotel charge. No women's circle. One-on-one. Evening. Boutique hotel. I closed the calendar without altering it. Screenshot. Logged. By now, the shape of her frameworks was clear enough, but I needed more. Harder edges. Traceable patterns. That evening, after she left for a late yoga class, I contacted an old colleague, David K. Discreet, sharp. Not a divorce attorney, not yet, but corporate legal with a specialty in data security and asset shielding. I kept it simple. I need to map some financial irregularities. Quietly. Can we meet? He replied within an hour. My office Thursday. No paper trail. In the meantime, I expanded my observation window. I began cross-referencing her location data from shared apps. Nothing overt, just background syncing we'd always used for convenience. Patterns emerged. Her stated locations didn't always match. And always, RK's events and retreats were in proximity. Emotionally, I found myself straddling a strange divide. Part of me wanted to believe there was still a line she hadn't crossed, some version of innocence left, but the evidence spoke differently, and as the pieces fit closer, an older instinct kicked in, one I hadn't used since building my company from scratch, the cold discipline of strategic analysis. No emotion in the notes. Just facts. When she came home that evening, relaxed, animated about her circle's energy, and how they were doing really deep integration work. I smiled, asked a few benign questions. She responded easily, unworried. The confidence of someone who still believed she was 2 moves ahead. She wasn't. Not anymore. I spent that night compiling the first full timeline. When I finished, it was nearly 2 a.m. I sat back, reading through the sequence. Financial anomalies, calendar slips, location mismatches, coaching influence deepening, and RK at the center. Not just some coach. A pivot point. The question now wasn't if something deeper was happening. The question was how deep, how wide, and how dangerous. And soon, I intended to find out. By the time Thursday came, I had no more illusions about where things were headed. David's office was in a converted brownstone, old money architecture, updated for modern discretion. I arrived early, carrying nothing but a mental file. He waved me in, closed the door behind us. No staff present. What are we looking at? He asked, direct. Emerging personal and professional conflict of interest, I replied. Possibly asset exposure. Early stage. He studied me for a beat. How early? Not early enough. That was all it took. David opened a secure laptop and we got to work. First pass. Corporate backgrounding on Sovereign Horizons Group. Thin structure. Multiple shell LLCs layered through Delaware and Nevada. But there were connections. RK, full name Richard Kellen, was tied to several groups known in the fringe consulting world. Not illegal, but not exactly clean either. Gray market operators, sovereignty, mindset architecture, corporate rewiring. Interesting company he kept, former hedge fund players, boutique intelligence firms, pseudo-therapeutic organizations with fluid boundaries. On the surface, all about personal evolution. Below, more about influence networks and leverage. David flagged a pattern of asset targeting in past engagements, consultants embedding themselves in leadership circles, extracting internal intel under the guise of personal transformation work. Sounded familiar. Next layer, personal financial tracing. David helped me scrub recent joint and personal accounts. Over the last 6 months, a 60% spike in her spending on self-development, private consults, luxury retreats, payments routed through merchant accounts tied to RK's ecosystem. Some of the charges obscured, run through, wellness, fronts and shell event firms. But the pattern was clear. And this wasn't cheap coaching. This was high-stakes grooming. As the data accumulated, an old ache surfaced, memories of when she and I had built things together. Our first business, a consultancy we'd started on pure grit. First house, first investment portfolio. Nights spent side by side at the kitchen table, mapping out strategy, chasing dreams that belonged to both of us. And now this. Not growth, not partnership, a calculated coup. One that presumed I would remain passive long enough for the trap to spring. They were wrong. I left David's office with a flash drive of secured data and a recommendation for a forensic accountant. I'd follow up within the week. That night, as she packed for another immersion, I observed closely. Same language, circle, sacred space, integration. But the booking had already cleared, another high-end property, this time under a wellness event front. When she kissed my cheek goodbye, the distance was palpable. But she still believed I was unaware. After she left, I deepened the net, set up private tracking, initiated a quiet background watch on her communications and patterns. Not invasive, just calibrated. Enough to map the network she was moving within. The line between personal and professional was blurring fast. And beneath it all, something deeper twisted in my gut. Because now, the nature of their relationship was no longer in question. One of the tracking pings returned late that night, her phone location logged at the Mercer, a private suite hotel, far from the advertised retreat location. Cross-referenced RK's own social postings, geotagged within blocks of the Mercer, same night. Not proof yet, but very close. I stared at the screen for a long moment, breath steady. No illusions remained. This wasn't philosophy. It wasn't just personal growth. It was betrayal, layered, deliberate, and accelerating. I updated my timeline, encrypted the file, and prepared for the next phase. They wanted a modern game? Fine. I'd modernize my playbook. And next I would find out just how wide this network went. The following week moved with cold precision. By day, I kept my professional routine steady. Board meetings, acquisition negotiations, team reviews. Externally, no change. Internally, the war room had opened. David connected me to a forensic specialist, Mira, sharp, quiet, with a background in corporate counterintelligence. We met in an unmarked office suite. I laid out what I had: financial spikes, tracking anomalies, network mapping. She reviewed quickly. "You're dealing with a hybrid play," she said. "Philosophical grooming wrapped around financial leverage. Not new, but getting more sophisticated." I nodded. "I need to know how far it's spread, and if there's deeper exposure." She got to work. Meanwhile, I started combing through shared digital assets. Nothing invasive, only what was legitimately co-owned. That's when I found it. A legal folder we'd used for years, estate planning, corporate filings. Buried inside, a draft document titled Modern Marital Framework, Working Draft. I opened it carefully, reading line by line. The language was clinical, detached, clearly influenced by legal coaching, possibly external advisors. It began with abstract principles: recognizing evolving identities, honoring autonomous personal trajectories. But deeper in, it turned hard. All prior agreements of joint ownership subject to renegotiation based on each partner's evolving autonomy. Legacy financial obligations to remain honored in alignment with conscious partnership principles. In plain terms, she intended to restructure the marriage, not end it. A new model where I would remain financially responsible, while personal loyalty and traditional commitments were dissolved. A gilded cage for one, freedom for the other. And the kicker: timelines for implementation discussions, coinciding with her upcoming immersion retreats. I sat back, the document open on my screen, breath slow. This was no stumble. No phase. It was a strategy. And she'd left the file where she assumed I wouldn't look, because in her mind, I was still playing the old version of myself. That night, we had dinner at home. She was animated, describing new insights from her group work, how relationships were containers, how traditional models created energetic imbalances. I asked polite questions, kept my tone curious. I noticed her increasing ease, convinced I was still on board, still believing in her narrative. But beneath that calm, a deeper fracture was forming. Because earlier that day, Mira had surfaced a new layer, encrypted financial transfers tied to RK's parent group, and a private communication, flagged metadata from a shared cloud sync she'd failed to properly segregate. A message partial but clear. Last night was beyond what words can hold. This work, and you. Time-stamped from her last immersion weekend. Sender RK. I stared at that fragment for a long while. Not surprised. Not even angry. The part of me that could have burned with rage had already been cauterized. This wasn't about love lost. It was about deception calculated. And now, I knew the dimensions. A personal entanglement threaded through a professional agenda. The pieces were aligned, personal, legal, financial. No going back. That evening, as she cleared the dishes and smiled across the kitchen, saying, "I feel like we're really moving into a new space," I returned her smile. "We are," I said softly. "We definitely are." But the space I was moving into was one she couldn't see, yet. And soon, I would make sure she couldn't follow. By the end of that week, Myra's full intelligence packet was ready. I reviewed it in my office late on a Friday night. Lights low, door locked. I wanted no interruptions. What I read shifted everything. RK, Richard Kellen, wasn't just an independent operator. Sovereign Horizons Group was directly linked to Veritas Capital Partners, a consortium that had recently initiated back-channel inquiries about a potential acquisition of my firm. Through intermediaries, Veritas had quietly been gathering internal cultural intelligence, leadership tendencies, friction points, strategic blind spots. And the source of much of that intelligence? My wife. The evidence was explicit: emails, meeting notes, anonymized case reflections that mirrored exact scenarios I'd discussed with her in private, down to phrases I'd used, leadership challenges we'd faced. Layered through it all were the communications with RK, deeply personal, increasingly intimate. The affair wasn't incidental. It was integral. Emotional leverage opening channels of influence. One flagged message between her and a Veritas consultant chilled me. "We're seeing the shifts you seeded taking root. Continue aligning narrative at home. Stability perception is key for now. In other words, keep me blind, keep me compliant, until they moved." I sat with that line for a long time. This wasn't just betrayal of trust. It was a coordinated dismantling of my life's work, using proximity and intimacy as a weapon. The no-going-back moment wasn't an explosion. It was a settling clarity. I no longer wanted to believe she might stop this. The version of her I had loved, built a life with, was already gone. In her place stood a woman I barely recognized, calculated, rehearsed, convinced of her enlightened narrative while entwined in a predatory network. And now, I would move accordingly. By Sunday, the first phase of my strategic firewall was in place. David and I restructured sensitive data channels. Mira established active surveillance on Veritas touchpoints. I initiated asset protection protocols, quietly moving holdings into insulated structures she couldn't touch without triggering alerts. I also filed preemptive legal documentation securing my IP rights and severing potential commingling vulnerabilities. Simultaneously, I prepared for controlled disclosures. Compliance officers at my firm would need to be brought in, carefully, timing coordinated to maximize legal leverage. The entire process unfolded with a cold efficiency I hadn't tapped in years, muscle memory from the early days of building under fire. But beneath the precision, something rawer stirred. Each step reinforced the depth of her betrayal. Each new layer of exposure widened the internal fracture. And at home? The contrast grew almost surreal. She returned from her weekend. Deep integration retreat. On Sunday night, glowing, loose, eyes bright with what she called new clarity. We sat across from each other at the kitchen island. She poured herself tea, touched my hand lightly. "I feel like we're on the verge of such a powerful new chapter," she said softly. I met her gaze evenly. I feel things are becoming very clear, I replied. She smiled, mistaking my tone for alignment, and then, as if to cement her narrative, she retrieved her notebook and began reading sections aloud, visions of new relational models, financial energy realignment, sovereign restructuring of partnership roles. Each word was another blade. I watched her, listened carefully. The confidence in her voice, the certainty in her worldview. She believed she had the upper hand, intellectually, emotionally, strategically. But the game had already shifted beneath her feet. Later that night, after she slept, I finalized the confrontation packet, transaction trails, her modern marital framework, draft, communications with RK and Veritas, insider intelligence evidence, and one final piece, a legal brief prepared by David, outlining potential insider trading implications linked to her disclosures. I sealed the file. Tomorrow, I would set the stage. As I shut down the computer, a memory surfaced, one of the earliest nights we'd celebrated a contract win. The two of us on the floor of our first office, champagne and paper cups, laughing, exhausted but victorious. That woman was gone, and in her place stood an adversary. I took a slow breath, steady. The confrontation would come, and when it did, it would end this on my terms. She returned late Monday afternoon, suitcase in hand, expression light. Another deep dive retreat completed, another layer of self-actualization presumably unlocked. I'd already prepared the space, the dining table cleared except for one item, a single black folder laid precisely at center. No dinner set. No wine opened. A different ritual tonight. She noticed immediately. Her gaze flicked to the folder, then to me. "What's this?" she asked lightly, voice too casual. I gestured to the chair opposite mine. "Sit," I said quietly. "We need to review some things." A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. Then she smiled, a practiced smile, and sat. I opened the folder. No dramatics, just methodical placement. First, transaction records, her payments to Sovereign Horizons Group and related shells. Next, her draft of the modern marital framework, printed and annotated. Then, email and message excerpts, communications with RK and Veritas highlighted. Finally, David's legal brief, detailing potential insider trading exposure linked to her unauthorized disclosures. I slid the folder toward her, leaned back. Silence stretched as she began reading. Her breath caught on the third page. Eyes flicked up to mine. "Where did you?" I didn't answer. Watched. Waited. She continued reading, pace quickening, fingers trembling slightly by the time she reached the legal brief. When she finally looked up, her face had paled. "You're misinterpreting things," she said, voice brittle. "This is exploratory work. You're framing it." I spoke evenly. "You've been feeding proprietary intelligence to a consortium targeting my firm. You've drafted a legal framework to bind me financially while removing personal accountability. And your personal relationship with RK is documented, both through transactions and communications." She opened her mouth, then closed it. A beat of silence. Then dismissive. She straightened, chin lifting. "You're making this adversarial when it doesn't have to be. These frameworks are about evolving past old hierarchies. You're stuck in a scarcity mindset." I said nothing. Just watched her. Her control began to fray. Next phase, defensive. Hands flat on the table now. Voice tightening. "You don't understand the depth of this work. It's not about taking from you. It's about creating something new. For both of us." Still, I remained silent. Finally, distressed. Shoulders dropping, breath shaking. "We don't have to do this way," she whispered. We can find a conscious path through this." That was when I spoke. Calm. Precise. "You modernized the marriage," I said quietly. "I've modernized my exit." I tapped the folder once. "The lawyers will speak now." She stared at me, silent, eyes wide. The gap between the narrative she'd built and the reality before her finally collapsing. I rose, collected my keys, and left the room. Behind me, the silence was absolute. The first ripple landed 3 days after the confrontation. David, moving with surgical timing, handed our compiled evidence to corporate counsel and compliance officers. The reaction was swift. Veritas Capital Partners came under immediate scrutiny. Internal reviews escalated to external legal notification. The flagged communications between my wife and their consultants, paired with her insider insights, triggered mandatory reporting. By week's end, The SEC had been alerted. An official inquiry opened: industrial intelligence theft, potential insider trading. Simultaneously, the personal implosion began. Mira traced Sovereign Horizon's merchant accounts. A series of irregularities surfaced fast. Financial transactions flagged, accounts frozen. My wife's coaching LLC, her new pride, halted in place. No operating capital, no access. Publicly, it started as a whisper, industry circles sharing cautious notes about predatory sovereignty cults. Then media caught scent, small first, investigative blogs, niche podcasts. But momentum built. Within a week, headlines on emerging consulting scams targeting leadership circles. RK's group collapsed overnight. Website offline. Profiles scrubbed. Clients fleeing. At home, the fracture turned glacial. She remained in the house, for now, drifting in a state of stunned inertia. The confrontation had shattered her narrative, but not yet rebuilt her sense of action. Our conversations? Minimal. Transactional. My tone remained calm, controlled. No gloating. Just boundaries. The divorce filings moved forward, shielded, strategic. Custody not relevant, but asset protection paramount. David ensured my holdings remained secured. Preemptive claims blocked any attempt at leverage. She attempted no counters. The legal weight, and the public collapse, had pinned her in place. Socially, the isolation began. Friends who'd once embraced her new philosophy vanished overnight, fearful of association, reputations to protect. Her social feeds shifted from curated empowerment to silence, messages unanswered, retreat invitations revoked. I watched it all from a measured distance. No triumph, just grim clarity. Thank you for watching. Bye.